Hey everybody, Chris Armiger, Fort Myers Beach Fire. My module, the case study for this module is going to be Love Canal, Niagara Falls, 1970. So as we go through the case study, I think the book says there's 5 stages of the disaster. So real brief, stage 1, you find out that you're the city manager of a large city, and the city's population is expanding rapidly, so there's some new development going on. There's a need for a new school, and you find out that there was some of the land that has recently been purchased for this expansion was previously a dump site for a chemical company. So it says, what problems could come from it, what safety considerations should you make, what resources do you need to contend with the issue, and your communication plan. So ideally, you need to always consider and plan for the worst in any circumstance, right? So you may not know or have an understanding of the specifics of each hazardous chemical. You know that there's that there's hazards there, but you don't know how significant they are. So you have to assume the worst. In the time frame of this study, I would imagine there was lots of this sort of stuff going on where there was industrial usage there was a lot of industrial use as far as property use and land use, and there was not a lot of responsible management of the industrial waste. So there was a lot of dumping on property owned by these manufacturers, just away from the manufacturing site on the property. An example is they have a 100-acre parcel of land, and maybe the first 20 acres is parking, refinement, and the warehouse and maintenance and develop is the plant. So they have like this back portion of the property where they dump their waste, and there's just not a lot of consideration in terms of responsible management for that. So you have a multi-generational systemic problem with managing this waste over probably the next century. If you consider this time frame started in the early 19 to mid 1900s, we're going to be dealing with this halfway through the next century. So, but as the city manager, what do you want to do? Is you want to start you want to try to identify the geographical location of the waste, and then start considering what sort of tertiary boundaries exist for that waste to contaminate, how much of it needs to be cordoned off, and the lifetime of expected use when you can redevelop that property before you start allowing permitting and stuff like that for new construction or any sort of use. And you're going to need specialists for that because, again, in this time frame, the 1970s, there's that's not something that there's probably not a lot of standard protocols for or even consideration for how to do that, how to map out land usage when you have waste on property. So you move to stage 2, and it says that the school board begins construction of a school on the property or near the property, and what's your plan of action to deal with that? And at the same time, there's lower income residences being built in the same proximity to the site. That when the property was sold, it was sold with not so much a clause, not even so much a warning, but just a mention that, hey, we'll sell it to you for $1 because it has really no value, because there's a lot of waste in there and we don't really want to deal with it. So we'll sell it to you and it's your problem. So, do what you will. So it was sold with that caveat. So again, the idea is, if you're the city manager, is before you allow new permitting, you need to really inspect that property and come up with a plan based, from experts' advice on how you can mitigate the damage or remove the damage or whatever you need to do to get all that stuff out of there, so you can either redevelop it or how to contain it, and how to determine a time frame to quarantine the property before it can be used again. But what's interesting with this one, and the takeaway for me, is so stages 4 and stages 5. There's some things that were mentioned that are worth discussing. So stage 4 talks about at this point, the president. So everybody's sick. Everybody's getting sick. They realize that it's a hazardous waste site, that it's not safe for humans to occupy, to drink the water, to have anything to do with anything that has to do with that land. So there's leaching there's leaching of the waste into the soil, which is leaching into the water, and I'm sure that there's toxic fume, and the air quality is poor close to the site. So it's gone all the way up to the president. He is aware of it and has declared the site a disaster, a federal disaster. So why is that important? Because it allows the funding mechanism for the site to be cleaned, for the property to be purchased, and people to be relocated. So when we talk about emergency management and mitigation strategies, one that comes up a lot is land development and purchasing buyback of land, especially when we talk about like flooding. We buy back properties, we buy back land, even if we have to do it through eminent domain, and relocate people and structures and infrastructure and services away from places that have the highest risk, that we really can't protect those properties. It's not feasible to dam them and shore them and dike them and all those other things to mitigate the flood. It's just more feasible to relocate whatever's there and use that land as it was intended to be used for natural drainage or whatever. So it's the same sort of thing in stage 4. Is they say, well, what if there's people that don't want to leave? I mentioned earlier in the case study that the industry, the hazardous waste industry company had sold the property to the school or to the town because they were going to, if they didn't, let them buy it, they were going to go the eminent domain route to get the property because they needed it for the expansion for the low income of the school. So you would use the same tenant, the eminent domain, to get the people out of there who don't necessarily buy into the, hey, it's really not that dangerous and you can't make me leave, this is my property sort of thing. If you can prove what you have and it's been declared a federal disaster, you absolutely can make them leave. And you do that, the recourse would be through the eminent domain laws. And then stage 5 of the disaster, which was the most interesting to me and the biggest takeaway, is it talks about the CERCLA, the Comprehensive Emergency Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. And what that does is that kind of segues into what we call today is the Superfund. And the Superfund is, it talks about it a little bit here in the text, and I had a bunch of notes about it just because it was very interesting to me. And so EPA goes out and identifies sites, and they earmark these sites on the national priority list. So you get this NPL designation. And once a site has an NPL designation, then the Superfund will either force the property owner, responsible party for the hazardous release, to clean the site, or if they don't do it, then EPA will come in and clean the site, and then they will recover the funds. They'll sue them essentially, or lien their property or lien their profits until they recover the cost of the cleanup. So what's interesting with all this stuff is, at the same time, this Love Canal, well, within about 10 years after Love Canal was very important because it was the first time the president had got involved and they had declared this sort of hazardous incident a federal disaster. But it was kind of the segue definitely for CERCLA and the Superfund. But also there was a movie that came out in the late 90s, almost 2000, with John Travolta. It was called Civil Action. Yeah, Civil Action. And it was about a town in Massachusetts, Woburn. And there was a few families that had been poisoned and from the drinking water. And the movie, it's loosely based on the facts about that case, but was about the town actually had decades in the past, they needed a source of drinking water for this town, Woburn, which is outside of Boston. So they couldn't get they couldn't get well municipal water to them, so they were going to put in wells. So they started tapping wells, and testing water, and it was hazardous. The whole water table was hazardous, and they knew that. The government did, the city government knew that, but they needed to expand housing, so they tapped these wells anyway, and these wells had all these heavy metals and contaminants and all these other things that were not fit for human consumption, but they put them in anyway. They were marked well G and well H, and they were the municipal water supply for these towns. And if you follow that case, it's popular in that movie. It was John Travolta. It was this tetrachloroethylene was really what brought attention to it, was because people found these barrels of the waste in the river, and they thought that they had pinpointed the site, and they thought that they had caught the people red-handed who were dumping hazardous chemicals into this little creek that fed into the wells. But that wasn't the case. What was making the people sick was not necessarily this product, and there weren't any trace amounts of that product in the drinking water. It was only when they did the test because they thought they had caught the people poisoning their water, that they realized that the water table was polluted. And then you go backtrack the history and found it had gone back all the way to some point in time in the 50s when they first started drilling these wells. But anyway, what's interesting, the takeaway for me is, if you go on to the EPA website, you can find all these NPLs, these National Priority List sites. We're in Region 4 if you're in the state of Florida, and that covers us, I think, Alabama and Georgia, up to South Carolina. And there's about 1,000 active sites, and there's about 1,800 listed for our region, Region 4, because it lists sites that have been cleaned and sites that are pending being added to the list. So when you look at it, what's interesting to me, and as an emergency manager and as a land use planner and whatever role you might take on with this sort of educational background, is when you look at the map of Florida, what you'll find is a lot of the sites surround the ports. So like Port of Miami, Jacksonville, Port of Tampa, and up in North Florida, there's where our big ports are is where you find most of it. So I would suspect a lot of that has to do with, because the ports, not that Florida is very old in terms of its economic life, but the ports obviously have a lot of, at the very least, fuel and chemicals come in and they go out. You also, where the ports are, within a small vicinity, are also where we have our nuclear sites for our power, our nuclear power plants in the state. And it's also where you find the cheapest commercial property. So that's where you have most of your industrial. But what's curious about that is that's where, like I said, a lot of those are going to be by big metro sites where there's a lot of population, because we expanded from the shoreline into the center of the state. So just if you're curious, go to the EPA's website, look for active NPL sites. You can even type in your zip code and it'll show you everything that's close to you. But the Superfund, that was the biggest takeaway for me from this one. So I'll watch everybody else's videos. I hope you learned something from mine. I always learn something from yours. And I'll see you guys on the next one. Thanks.